The transport shuttle landed with a low hiss, its repulsors flattening a wide circle of violet ferns beneath its weight. The back hatch opened with a clank, and humid air, thick with the scent of wet moss and unfamiliar pollen, flooded into the cadet compartment. Elena Park stepped forward, squinting as the light fractured through the green canopy of the planet Xeloria. For a moment, everything felt still, as though the planet itself was holding its breath. Curious about these strange newcomers, she adjusted the strap of her utility pack and followed the line of cadets, each wearing their Academy-issued jungle gear and receiving individual assignments from a robotic supervisor. The Galactic Academy of Interspecies Medicine prided itself on pushing the boundaries of its cadets, and this year's final exam was a no-tech survival rescue. Stabilize and heal a wounded cadet using nothing but the natural resources found in the jungle environment. Elena was human, one of only 3 at the Academy, and she already felt the skepticism radiating from the other species. Most of them came from hyper-advanced civilizations where illness had been practically eradicated. The Xyrans, the Volari, the Kelvathi. Each species relied so heavily on biotechnological implants that treating wounds without nanogels or regenerative fields was considered ancient history. But for this exam, those luxuries were gone. One by one, cadets were assigned a synthetic patient, android replicas programmed with randomized injuries and artificial vitals. Elena waited her turn patiently, watching the others take off into the dense jungle with their lifeless simulacra. When her turn finally came, the robotic examiner paused. There was a flicker of something wrong in its optic sensor. A small red alert blinked silently on its chest panel. Elena Park, it buzzed. Unit malfunction. Reassigning you to organic patient, Velic. Species, Exurin. Status, unstable due to pre-existing injuries sustained during drop sequence. Time limit unchanged. Begin. Before Elena could respond, the floor hatch opened, and a stretcher with a living, barely conscious alien was lowered in front of her. Velak's green-gray skin was streaked with dirt and fluid from a head wound. His forearms twitched involuntarily, and his eyes were unfocused. A real patient, not a test dummy, and from a species that rarely trusted others, much less humans. She crouched beside him, placing 2 fingers on his neck, just under his mandible, a basic vitals point for Xyrans. His pulse was irregular, fast, and shallow. She glanced up at the robot, stunned. "Why isn't anyone helping him?" she asked. "Assistance prohibited. Test parameters in effect." And with that, the robot whirred away, gliding back toward the shuttle without a second glance. Elena looked down at Velak, then at the jungle around her. No signals, no tech, just her, an unconscious alien, and a planet full of unknowns. She had no time to waste. Elena hoisted Velak onto a basic sled she crafted from her emergency tarp and nearby branches, securing him with the straps from her pack. The terrain was uneven, thick with undergrowth that coiled and hissed like living veins. Every few meters she stopped to check his breathing. His skin had a faint shimmer, and his body heat was rising. Signs of internal inflammation or infection, though she had no scanner to confirm it. Within an hour, she found a shallow clearing under a towering tri-leaf tree with a low-hanging canopy, dense enough to serve as cover. The roots created natural walls, and the ground felt dry compared to the soggy moss in the lowlands. It wasn't perfect, but it was defensible and hidden from aerial predators. She cleared out the insects using smoke from dried pod husks and laid Velak onto a raised platform of woven vines and bark. Now came the hard part. Elena opened her field notebook, the only piece of tech allowed during the exam, and started sketching the plants around her. Her grandmother had taught her how to survive in the forests of the Appalachian Ranges, back on Earth, using bark for antiseptic, berries for clotting, and roots for fever. That knowledge was considered outdated by most of the galaxy, but right now it was all she had. She began testing plants the way her grandmother once showed her, with smell, skin contact, and observation. She smeared sap onto the underside of her wrist, waited 15 minutes, then pressed a warmed pebble over the area to test for heat or rash. She crushed leaves and placed small amounts near local insects to see if they were attracted or repelled. She watched how the animals reacted to fruits and flowers, marking the ones they avoided. Time passed quickly. Velik's breathing turned shallower, and the wound on his side began to darken with a greenish tint, possibly necrosis, or an allergic reaction. Without antiseptic or sterilization, any contamination could spread. She needed something to draw out infection and something to reduce fever. Her first breakthrough came at dusk. While exploring the edges of the clearing, she found a thick bluish plant whose leaves folded in when touched, a behavior similar to Earth's Mimosa pudica. She crushed its stem and noticed a strong citrus-like scent. Testing it on herself, she felt a tingling cold. Nearby, she spotted that the base of the plant grew near a cluster of small burrowing insects, which used it as shelter, suggesting it wasn't toxic. She boiled its leaves in a cup made from hardened pod shell, using hot rocks heated in fireless friction. Another trick from her grandmother. The steam smelled clean and sharp. She soaked a strip of bark in the mixture and gently pressed it to Velik's wound. His muscles jerked in response, but his skin began to calm, losing its angry red hue. Encouraged, Alina made a poultice from the ground leaf pulp and applied it across the wound, binding it with vine fibers and moss. As night fell, Zaloria came alive with sounds. Shrill whistles, deep groans, the thud of distant footsteps. But Alina stayed focused. She spent hours fanning Velik, collecting water from dew and condensation, and monitoring his condition. His fever didn't worsen. His pulse stabilized slightly. And for the first time since the drop, his eyes flickered open. He stared at her in silence, confusion clouding his expression. He tried to move, but Elena gently pressed her hand on his upper limb. "Don't," she whispered. "You're safe. Just stay still." He didn't respond, but the tension in his limbs softened. He let his eyes close again. Elena sat back, exhausted, her back against the root wall. She glanced upward through the canopy, where faint starlight shimmered through the vines. The Academy might have wanted to test medical skill, but here, on this wild planet, what mattered most wasn't theory. It was instinct, patience, and a willingness to listen to what the jungle was trying to say. Tomorrow, she would have to search deeper for more treatments. But for now, she had kept him alive. And that, she knew, was already a defiance of every expectation. Elena awoke just before dawn to the sound of deep thrumming in the jungle canopy, a natural alarm on Zaloria, as some massive creature broadcast its territory. The cool air had turned damp, and her muscles ached from having slept against a root wall with nothing but her jacket for insulation. Her eyes immediately found Velik. He was still unconscious, but his chest rose and fell in slow, even rhythm. The swelling around his wound had receded slightly, and the leaf poultice she had applied the night before remained in place, though discolored now with drawn-out fluid. She removed the bindings carefully. The skin beneath had begun to knit at the edges, though the wound remained open. It wasn't infected, not yet, but it would be if she didn't act faster. Velik's species heal differently. She recalled that Xyrans had regenerative skin, but only if the initial infection was stopped in time. If toxins entered his bloodstream now, his own body would turn against itself in autoimmune defense. That was the danger. She collected the old poultice, noting its smell. Sour, almost metallic. That meant the wound had expelled toxins. That was good. But it also meant she had reached the limits of that plant's medicinal strength. She would need something stronger to stop systemic damage and begin real recovery. With the last of her water used to clean her hands, she stood and scanned the clearing. Morning light shimmered through the green, filtered sky, and the jungle around her pulsed with life. She marked Velik's location with tied vine signals and began trekking further away from camp, deeper into the tangle of vines and oversized fungi that dominated this part of the terrain. Her steps were slow and deliberate. Each time she saw a new plant or growth, she paused. Some she recognized from the Academy's database back on the ship. The exam preparation had covered a few general species of medicinal alien flora, but most were new, unmapped, unclassified. She found a cluster of crimson pod plants growing near the base of a decaying tree. Their waxy outer skin shimmered like oil under sunlight. She watched as a small winged reptile landed on one, pecked it open, and almost immediately recoiled, flapping wildly before falling to the ground in spasms. Elena didn't need further testing. Those pods were toxic, perhaps even corrosive. She marked the location in her notes and moved on. Soon she came across a narrow clearing filled with oddly shaped spires. tall, bone-colored stalks with feathered tops. They looked like fungi but moved slightly in the breeze, releasing a faint lavender mist into the air. She noticed a species of small, monkey-like creature approach one, pluck a feather, and chew it. The creature's fur stood on end briefly, then it ran off with a burst of energy. Elena knelt and brushed her fingers along the stalk's base. The texture was spongy, and the stem released a sticky resin when pierced. She placed a bit of the sap on the back of her hand. It tingled, then numbed the skin. That could help with pain management, but would it be toxic internally? She would need a proxy. She turned to a nearby moss-covered boulder, where translucent slug-like creatures moved slowly over the surface. She carefully captured one in a leaf cup and placed a tiny drop of the sap on its back. The slug flinched, but didn't die. It retracted slightly, then resumed its slow crawl. She made a note: potential anesthetic, non-lethal, possibly anti-inflammatory. Elena returned to camp after 2 hours, hands full of bark shavings, sap-filled leaves, and boiled samples in pod shells. Velek had stirred in her absence, though only slightly. His breathing had changed, now strained with a slight wheeze. His skin looked paler, and his pupils were dilated. The fever had risen. She chewed her lip, working fast. She used the sap from the feather fungus to coat a woven bandage, placed it around the open wound, and used warm moss compresses soaked in distilled liquid from crushed blueberries. Astringent, but edible, based on earlier tests. As she worked, her own fingers began to shake, not from exhaustion, from pressure. If she failed here, this wasn't just about grades or ranking. Valak was real, and if he died, it wouldn't be academic, it would be personal. The afternoon passed in cycles of monitoring and minor interventions. She alternated sap poultices with steam vapors made from plant bark, letting Velek inhale through a funnel made of leaves. Slowly, his fever stopped climbing. By evening, the wheezing subsided. But then, just before sunset, she heard movement. Not animal, but deliberate, heavy-footed. She gripped a thick branch and crouched low. Through the foliage came another cadet. A Kelvathi student named Sharn, covered in mud and leaves. He looked haggard, his eyes wide, his hands empty. "I heard something," he gasped, stepping into the clearing. "I thought it was an animal, but what is that?" He pointed at Velek with visible alarm. Elena rose, still holding the branch. "He's my assignment," she said cautiously. "Why are you here?" Sharn looked behind him, then back. "My unit failed. The patient model shorted out. I tried to reboot, but never mind. I've been walking for hours. Have you got water?" Elena hesitated, then handed him a half-full pod shell. Sharn drank greedily, wiping his mouth with his forearm. "You've been working on him?" he asked after a pause. "Yes. He's real, yes." "You're insane," he muttered. "This is a death trap. None of this was supposed to be like this. The jungle, it's designed to mess with you. I think it's aware." She looked at him carefully, then back at her patient. "Go find another shelter," she said flatly. "I need quiet." "You're seriously going to keep playing nurse in this place?" he asked, incredulous. "What are you trying to prove?" She didn't answer. She turned and continued preparing a new batch of compresses. Eventually, he left without another word. That night, Velak spoke. His voice was dry and broken. "Hot." She turned quickly, adjusting his position and placing another cooled compress on his torso. "Drink this," she whispered, raising a leaf cup to his lips, slowly. "It'll help." He drank, grimaced, then relaxed. "You are not one of us," he said hoarsely. "No," she agreed. "I'm human." He was silent for a while. Then, "I thought humans were all noise and arrogance." "Some are," she replied. "Some of us are quiet." He closed his eyes again. "You are not unskilled." She smiled faintly. "Thanks." As night swallowed the clearing and distant thunder echoed from the horizon, Elena sat beside him, still wide awake. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, Velak was alive, and that meant the jungle had not won. Not yet. A heavy silence rested over the clearing as the jungle began to shift into its nocturnal rhythm. Somewhere in the trees a low rumble echoed. Not thunder this time, but a deep, rhythmic vibration that came from the ground itself. Elena tensed, her hand tightening around the curved bone shard she had sharpened earlier for defense. The tremors were brief, but they returned again a few minutes later, heavier, as if something enormous was waking below the surface of the planet. She knelt by Velek and checked his pulse again. His eyes were closed, but his skin tone was slightly richer than before, no longer the chalky gray-green of acute fever. That gave her a flicker of reassurance, but it didn't last. The air had grown thick, unusually warm and wet, and it clung to her skin like sweat-soaked linen. Insects had vanished from the clearing, and birds no longer sang. Even the wind had stilled. Then came the smell, a sharp metallic tang, ozone and soil, mixed with something acrid. Elena stood slowly and looked toward the canopy. Above the green curtain of vines, a faint reddish hue pulsed in the sky, flickering like heat lightning. She'd seen similar signs before in the Academy's planetary risk briefings. But this wasn't just a natural storm. This was what the locals called skyfall vapor, a precursor to Zaloria's flash acid rain, one of the planet's most lethal weather phenomena. She had maybe 20 minutes. Elena's heart pounded as she scanned the clearing. The shelter she had built was minimal, meant only for light protection. It wouldn't survive corrosive rainfall. She needed to create a barrier, a sealed structure, fast, and she had to do it while keeping Velek alive and immobile. There was no backup. No one was coming. She began ripping down the broadleaves of the tri-leaf trees, the only species she had observed surviving past storms. Their waxy coating and thick fiber layers repelled liquid for several hours before breaking down. She pressed them flat over the root structure, weaving them tightly between branches and thick vines. Her fingers moved quickly, eyes darting toward the canopy with each flash of red above. The first drops hissed when they hit the upper leaves, releasing white plumes of steam. Elena cursed under her breath and dragged Velek deeper into the shelter, wrapping his body in overlapping layers of bark and moss. The pain must have stirred him. His eyes fluttered open and his arms twitched weakly. "What's—" he began. "Don't speak," she ordered, placing her hand over his chest. "You're safe. Just stay still." He nodded faintly, trusting her completely, a trust she hadn't expected to earn. She closed off the final corner of the shelter, using every last leaf and vine she had. By the time the rain fully began, a loud hiss drowned out every other sound, like boiling water poured onto iron. The drops hit the leaves above and rolled down the outer layers, burning holes where the material thinned. Elena huddled close to Velek, using her own body to shield his wounded side while she monitored the gaps for breaches. The shelter trembled as the storm intensified, but it held. Smoke rose through the makeshift seams, but the structure remained intact for an hour, long enough for the worst of the storm to pass. When the hissing quieted and the smell faded, she waited 10 more minutes before crawling toward the edge. The jungle beyond was a different world now. The ground had turned into a slurry of melted bark, skeletonized leaves, and shallow puddles of steaming chemical residue. Trees closest to the clearing were stripped bare. A thick mist rose from every surface, and it was hard to breathe without coughing. She returned to Velek, who had drifted in and out of consciousness during the storm. His face was pale again, lips slightly dry, but his fever hadn't returned. The painkillers she had made earlier must have helped, but they were temporary. She needed something regenerative now, something that could activate his body's natural healing cycle. Elena reviewed her notes under the dim red glow of her emergency bioluminescent vial. One entry stood out. A soft-stemmed, thorn-covered plant she had avoided earlier because of its odor. She remembered seeing birds consume its fruit and violently regurgitate the seeds, only to return to the same plant hours later. It was a paradox, toxic in the short term, but perhaps medicinal in the long run. If she was right, the plant had purgative properties, which in smaller doses might stimulate immune activity. It was risky, but everything else had been too. At first light, she left the shelter and ventured to where she'd seen the thornfruit plant. The path was treacherous, mud bubbling beneath her boots, steam rising in columns around her. Her arms and legs stung from cuts and burns made by acidic mist, but she pressed forward. When she finally reached the plant, she wrapped her fingers in a thick vine for protection and twisted off 2 bulbous fruit. They were slick and pulsing, as if alive. She gagged from the smell but forced herself to collect sap using a pod cup, careful not to let it touch her skin. Back at the shelter, she diluted the sap with purified water and added a crushed mixture of calming leaf powder. She sat beside Velak, steadying his head as she tilted the liquid toward his lips. "This may hurt," she whispered. He drank it slowly, grimaced, and let out a low hiss, then clutched his chest. For a moment she feared she'd made a fatal mistake. But soon his muscles relaxed, his breathing slowed, and his hands dropped away. He was asleep, not unconscious, but resting. Real rest. She collapsed beside him, letting herself fall into sleep for the first time in nearly 30 hours. When she awoke, someone was watching her. A drone. It hovered silently just beyond the clearing, its matte-becked shell absorbing light as it filmed the shelter, the patient, and Elena herself. She stared at it, too exhausted to care. So the Academy had been watching. The entire storm, the treatment, the decision-making. But what had they expected? For her to run? To let him die? She looked away and tended to Velak again. His wound was beginning to close at the edges now, and his skin showed signs of cellular regeneration. The experimental mixture had worked. She smiled faintly, brushing hair out of her eyes. The test hadn't been about medicine, not really. It had been about whether she would follow protocol, abandon a liability, or adapt with instinct and empathy. A test not of knowledge, but of judgment. And from the shadow in the trees she had passed, even if she hadn't known she was being graded at all. The air aboard the Academy's orbital station was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the steaming jungle below. Elena sat in the debrief chamber, her boots still caked with jungle grit, the smell of moss and acid rain clinging stubbornly to her uniform. A white medical patch was strapped across her right forearm, where the acidic mist had left a burn, and her knuckles were still raw from weaving vines under pressure. She hadn't slept properly since returning, but she refused the stim injections offered by the med drone. She wanted to be fully awake for what was about to happen. The room was dimly lit, amphitheater style, with ascending tiers where faculty members of the Galactic Academy of Interspecies Medicine sat in heavy seats lined with biosynthetic padding. Each professor's species was represented: a Ziran biologist with fluid motion sensors, a crystalline Valari scholar whose speech came through harmonic frequencies, a gelatinous Salkai philosopher suspended in nutrient gel, and at the center, a towering Threxian named Professor Varric, head of xenopathology and notoriously dismissive of human medicine. A spherical drone hovered behind him, projecting Elena's footage onto the curved display that wrapped around the room. Clips cycled across the screen in silence, Elena constructing the shelter, applying the poultices, speaking softly to Velak as the storm raged overhead. Then the footage zoomed in on the moment she administered the thornfruit sap. The moment she took the greatest risk. Professor Varric lifted one clawed hand and signaled the projection to pause. She administered an untested substance derived from an unknown plant, he said, addressing the tribunal. No peer-reviewed analysis, no molecular breakdown, no cross-species safety trials. By all accounts, this was a reckless and emotional act. He turned his cold, yellow eyes toward Elena. "How do you respond, Cadet Park?" She rose from her seat, spine straight despite the tremor in her legs. "I observed local wildlife behavior," she said. "I tested small quantities using indirect exposure. I diluted the active compound and neutralized known irritants. The effects were calculated, not random." Varric leaned forward, his mandibles clicking slightly. "You administered it to a Ziran cadet, a living, sentient being. If your calculations had failed, the resulting reaction could have been fatal. Are you saying that primitive observations are a sufficient justification for experimental treatment?" Elena held his gaze. "I'm saying that field conditions don't always allow for perfect data, and that doing nothing would have been fatal," the tribunal murmured. The Valari professor emitted a high-pitched tone, which the drone translated. "We have reviewed the logs of all cadets deployed during the exam. Out of 32 participants, 27 failed to stabilize their synthetic subjects. 2 caused cascading system failures. Only 1 successfully kept an organic patient alive through the storm. That cadet stands before us." Professor Varric narrowed his eyes. "Success born from instinct is not the same as science. This academy teaches medicine, not myth." A soft voice cut through the tension. "Then you must decide whether your definition of medicine includes survival." All heads turned. The voice belonged to Professor Jeline, a Neruvi historian whose body resembled a human silhouette encased in flowing bioluminescent silk. She rarely spoke during tribunals. Now she stepped forward, her delicate hands clasped behind her back. "Many civilizations began with instinct," she said. "Our own species used earth fire, bark resin, insect venom, and fermented roots before we ever had microscopes. Shall we strip all those discoveries from our legacy because they lacked lab verification at the time?" Vurick exhaled sharply through his vents. "This is not about history, it is about precedent." "No," said another voice, lower, strained but clear. All eyes shifted to the chamber's side door as it opened. Valak stepped through, supported by a hover brace. His uniform hung loose over his recovering frame, and his gait was uneven, but his presence froze the tribunal in place. "I gave permission to speak," he said, his tone unwavering. "I am the cadet in question." Vurick's mandibles twitched. "This is highly irregular. You were not summoned." Valak stepped forward anyway, drawing strength from the brace at his side. "But I was the patient. I was the variable. If you are to judge her actions, then you must consider what would have happened had she not acted." He stopped next to Elena and faced the professors directly. "She treated me with knowledge none of you taught. She took risks none of your simulations prepare for. And I am standing here because she did." Jelan nodded softly. "Let the patient be heard." Vurick fell silent, clearly displeased. The tribunal agreed unanimously to allow Velak's testimony. Elena said nothing. She simply watched him, unsure if she felt relief, gratitude, or the rising sting of something deeper, something that reminded her she had not been alone in that jungle, even when it felt like it. Velak looked at each professor in turn. When the storm came, he said, "The others abandoned their test sites. I saw it with my own eyes. Some hid in trees, some ran for the highlands, but she stayed. She fought the planet, she fought the odds, and she saved me. If this academy punishes that, then you're not training doctors, you're training bureaucrats." The chamber remained still for several seconds after he finished. Finally, the Salkai's gel chamber shimmered, indicating consensus. The drone's voice echoed across the chamber. "Final ruling. Cadet Elena Park's actions, while unconventional, fall within the parameters of emergent medical discretion under survival conditions. Her solutions are to be documented, peer-reviewed, and included as supplementary case study materials in future planetary medicine curricula." Professor Vurick stood slowly, his clawed hands tightening behind his back. "I dissent," he said, "but I accept the ruling." Lena allowed herself to breathe. Julin gave her a slight nod. "You may return to quarters. A full report will be requested. Rest. You have earned it." As the tribunal dispersed, Valak turned to her. His skin still looked pale, but his expression was brighter now. Not with gratitude, but with recognition. "I wasn't wrong about humans," he said quietly. "You are arrogant, but not in the way I thought." She smiled for the first time in days. "I'll take that as a compliment." He gave a small bow and left the chamber without another word. Elena remained still for a moment longer, staring at the blank projection wall. She had passed. But more than that, she had challenged something deeper than a test. And the academy, at least for now, had listened. 2 weeks after the tribunal, Elena sat in the circular glass atrium at the heart of the academy's medical research tower. The garden dome overlooked the curve of the planet below, where clouds swirled in pale blue layers over jungles and oceans. Around her, vines from a dozen worlds grew from transparent soil tanks, curling around the walls in silent spirals. Somewhere in the center, a pond full of shimmering Curilian lilyfish reflected the filtered sunlight above. Everything was calm, everything was ordered, but nothing inside her felt still. She stared at the slate-colored tablet on the table in front of her. It displayed her provisional report on the Zeloria field test, complete with timestamps, field recordings, biological sketches, and handwritten notes. She had revised it 3 times already. Each time she tried to remove the emotion from her writing, the urgency, the pain, the fear, only to realize that stripping it away made the truth feel hollow. The door behind her slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Professor Jeline entered, her bioluminescent robe flowing in waves of deep blue and violet. She walked gracefully, as if she were gliding, and took a seat beside Elena without a word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "I keep wondering if I did the wrong thing. Not out there, But here, writing it all down, like I'm turning something real into a classroom lesson. Jelen turned her head gently, the light of her robe shifting as she moved. That is what memory is, a story retold in layers, for others and for ourselves. I just don't want it reduced to a checklist. Step 1, identify plant. Step 2, test for toxicity. Step 3, trust your instincts. That's not what it felt like. Jelen folded her hands in her lap. Then tell them what it did feel like. The facts are yours to report. The truth is yours to share. Elena looked back down at the tablet and slowly nodded. Across the campus, something else was already changing. The Academy's Central Archive had begun processing her findings into a special edition journal, Frontline Xenomedicine, Adaptive Field Responses. The Academy Board, under pressure from the Faculty Council, had formally introduced a new curriculum component titled Biocultural Survival Systems. It would require cadets to complete units on indigenous healing methods, ancient earth remedies, and environmental adaptation through non-technological means. For the first time in Academy history, herbalists, tribal medics, and planetary naturalists from low-tech civilizations would be invited as adjunct lecturers. Some students grumbled, others embraced the change, but the ripple had begun. Elena's schedule changed too. She was assigned a mentorship role in the xenobotany lab, tasked with expanding documentation on cross-species medical interactions. Her first assistant was a shy fourth year from the Varnax system, who asked more questions than anyone she'd ever met. At first, she found his curiosity exhausting. Then she realized that this was exactly what she'd hoped for. Not blind reverence, but challenge, questions, exploration. One afternoon, while cataloging preserved samples from Zaloria's thornfruit plant, she found a small note tucked inside one of the containers. It was written in angular handwriting, the strokes neat and precise. I have requested your assistance for my advanced regeneration thesis. I will require someone whose recklessness occasionally results in brilliance. Velik. She laughed, a real laugh, and pocketed the note. The next day, she joined him in the biocellular regeneration wing. He was standing upright now, though he still carried a brace. His posture was stiffer, his movements slower, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He welcomed her with a nod and no further ceremony. For hours they worked in silence, synchronizing data logs and running cross-sections tissue simulations. At one point, he placed a culture slide under the scanner and gestured for her to look. Under the lens, a Zyran skin cell pulsed with faint green light, a healing signal response previously thought to activate only through neural interpol stimuli. But the node attached to the sample showed it had been triggered by a diluted version of the same compound Elena had created in the jungle. It worked, she murmured. It did more than work, he replied. You found a method to stimulate cellular repair without invasive tech. That changes how we approach field triage entirely. She turned toward him, the realization sinking in. This wasn't just survival, she said. It was discovery. Velik inclined his head. And now, it is knowledge. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in from across the quadrant. Conferences, interviews, research collaborations, but Elena accepted only one, an offer to co-author a new Academy field manual on applied biointuition in hostile environments. She titled the first chapter, Listen First, Act Second. Her story traveled further than she expected, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was undeniable. A single cadet on a dangerous planet had used what many called outdated knowledge and had done what drones, AI, and simulations could not. And so, slowly, the Academy rewrote itself. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Years later, Elena would return to Zaloria, not as a student, but as a lead researcher overseeing the creation of the first permanent xenobotanical medical outpost. As her boots touched down on the soil once again, she stood beside Velik, now fully recovered and heading a joint species research division. The jungle greeted them with the same silence as before, thick with breath and mystery, as if waiting, and this time she wasn't afraid. She knelt by the tri-leaf trees collecting fresh samples. The air smelled the same. The soil was still warm beneath her fingers. But something had changed. In her, in the Academy. In the future, they were helping shape. She looked up toward the filtered light through the canopy and let out a quiet exhale. The test was over. The work had just begun.